Marcus Junius Brutus did not stab Julius Caesar to save the Roman Republic. You've been told that lie for over 2,000 years. You heard it in high school history class. You saw it in Shakespeare's play. You've watched 100 documentaries frame the Ides of March as a noble stand for freedom against tyranny, a man of principle choosing his country over his closest friend. None of it is real. The most famous betrayal in Western civilization wasn't about ideals. It was about debt. It was about blackmail. It was about a tiny, corrupt aristocracy terrified of losing their fortunes, their power, and their stranglehold over Rome to a man who threatened to rewrite every rule that kept them on top. Brutus didn't kill Caesar to save Rome. He killed Caesar to save himself. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at the so-called liberators the same way again. Let's start with the story you already know. It's March 15th, 44 BC. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, walks into the Senate house. He's days away from launching a massive military campaign against Parthia, a campaign that would make him richer and more beloved than any Roman in history. The senators gather around him, supposedly to present a petition. Then, all at once, they strike. Daggers come out from under their togas. Caesar fights back at first, until he sees one face in the crowd. Marcus Junius Brutus, his closest friend, his protégé, the man he'd saved from ruin more than once. Caesar stops fighting. He pulls his toga over his face and utters those famous words. "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" Then he falls, dead at the base of a statue of Pompey, stabbed 23 times. And Brutus? He steps forward, blood on his hands, and tells the Roman people they're free. That he's struck down a tyrant to restore the Republic. 4 centuries, that's the version we've accepted. Brutus as the tragic hero, a man who hated what he had to do, but did it anyway because it was right. But here's the thing no one tells you. 2 years before that assassination, Marcus Junius Brutus was functionally bankrupt. He owed more money than most Roman senators would see in their entire lives. A debt so massive it would have destroyed his family name, stripped him of his political career, and left him in exile or worse. And the only man who could have forgiven that debt? The only man with the power to erase it with a single word? Julius Caesar. Now, you might be wondering, how does a Roman senator from one of the oldest, most prestigious families in Rome end up that deep in debt? Easy. Brutus wasn't the noble, humble statesman you've been taught. He was greedy, ruthlessly greedy, and he made his fortune the old-fashioned way for Roman elites, by extorting helpless people in the provinces. See, after Caesar pardoned Brutus for fighting against him in the Civil War, we'll get to that part later. He gave Brutus a plum job, governor of the island of Crete and the province of Cyrene in modern-day Libya. It was a gift, a chance for Brutus to get rich, rebuild his fortune, and come back to Rome with enough cash to climb the political ladder. And Brutus took full advantage. He squeezed those provinces dry. He imposed illegal taxes. He seized private property. He lent money to local cities at interest rates so high they were effectively loan sharking, rates up to 48% a year, when the legal limit in Rome was supposed to be 12%. And when the people of Crete couldn't pay, Brutus brought in Roman soldiers to seize their land, sell their families into slavery, and crush any protest. This wasn't some secret. The Roman historian Plutarch explicitly writes that Brutus's governorship was marked by greed and cruelty that tarnished his reputation. And who publicly condemned this kind of provincial exploitation? Who had built his entire political career on standing up to corrupt aristocrats robbing the provinces blind? Julius Caesar. If all of this is true, you might be asking, why does everyone think Brutus was a hero? Why has the story been told this way for 2,000 years? The answer is simple. The winners write the history book. Wait, no, actually, in this case, the people who had the best public relations team wrote the history books. See, Brutus and the other conspirators knew they had a branding problem. They were a small group of wealthy senators stabbing a popular leader to death. If they didn't frame it as a fight for freedom, the Roman people would tear them apart. So immediately after the assassination, they launched a massive propaganda campaign. They minted coins with Brutus's face on one side and a pile of daggers on the other, with the words, Ides of March, printed across. They gave speeches in the Forum framing Caesar as a tyrant who wanted to make himself king. They spread stories about Brutus's noble ancestry, about how his great-great-great-grandfather Lucius Junius Brutus had overthrown the last king of Rome and founded the Republic 450 years earlier. And here's the kicker. Most of the ancient historians who wrote about Caesar's assassination were either writing for the senatorial elite, or they were directly repeating Brutus's own propaganda. Plutarch, who wrote the most famous biography of Brutus, relied heavily on letters written by Brutus's friends and allies. He accepted their framing of events at face value. Even Shakespeare, 1,600 years later, pulled most of his plot from Plutarch's work. So the story of the noble Brutus? It's not history. It's a 2,000-year-old marketing campaign. But marketing only works if there's a kernel of truth people can grab onto. And Brutus's team leaned hard into the love of republic angle because it hid the real, far more brutal reason Brutus agreed to kill Caesar. A reason so personal, so shameful, he could never admit it publicly. Let's be clear. Marcus Junius Brutus did not join the conspiracy because he believed in the republic. He joined because he had no other choice. His debts were so enormous, his political future so fragile, that if Caesar stayed in power, Brutus was finished. The assassination wasn't an act of patriotism. It was an act of self-preservation. To understand just how brutal this betrayal really was, you have to understand how much Caesar had done for Brutus over the years. This wasn't just a casual friendship. This was a man who had repeatedly saved Brutus's life, his career, and his fortune. And Brutus stabbed him in the back anyway. Literally. Let's go back to the beginning. Brutus was born in 85 BC, to Marcus Junius Brutus the Elder and Servilia Scipiones. His father was killed when Brutus was still a boy, murdered by a political rival named Pompey the Great. Yes, that Pompey. The same man Brutus would later side with in the civil war against Caesar. But that's not the most interesting part of Brutus's family. The most interesting part is his mother, Servilia. Servilia was one of the most famous women in Rome. She was intelligent, ruthless, and politically connected. And she was Julius Caesar's mistress. For almost 30 years, long before Brutus was born, Caesar and Servilia were lovers. They stayed close even after Servilia married, even after Brutus was born, even as Caesar climbed the political ladder and married other women. There were even rumors in Rome at the time that Caesar was Brutus's real father. Most historians now think that's unlikely. Caesar was only 15 years old when Brutus was born, which is young even by Roman standards, but the rumor was widespread. And Caesar never did anything to deny it. Why does this matter? Because it meant Caesar had a soft spot for Brutus from the very beginning. He saw Brutus as almost family. And when Brutus got himself into financial trouble for the first time, in his early 30s, Caesar didn't just give him advice. He paid off his debt, out of his own pocket, a sum of money that would be worth millions of dollars today. No strings attached, no public fanfare. He just took care of it, because that's how much he cared about Brutus and his mother. If that level of generosity surprises you, hold on. It gets worse. Because when the Roman Civil War broke out in 49 BC, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, Brutus didn't side with the man who'd paid his debts, who'd been his mother's lifelong lover, who'd treated him like a son. No. Brutus sided with Pompey, Caesar's enemy, the same Pompey who'd murdered Brutus's father 20 years earlier. Let that sink in. Brutus chose to fight for the man who killed his own father, just to oppose Caesar. Why? Not because of principle. Because Pompey was the candidate of the senatorial elite, the optimate, the old money families who'd run Rome for centuries. Brutus was one of them. His family name meant he was part of the club, and the club hated Julius Caesar. Caesar was a populist. He appealed to the common people of Rome. To the veterans, the poor, the merchants, the people the senatorial elite looked down on. He passed land reform that gave farms to retired soldiers. He canceled debts for poor families crushed by high interest rate. He expanded Roman citizenship to people in the provinces, which meant more people had a stake in the system. All of this made him wildly popular with the masses, and it made him absolutely despised by the rich, old families who'd always called the shots. Brutus was one of those families. So even though Caesar had done more for him personally than any other man alive, even though Pompey had killed his father, Brutus picked the side of his class. He joined Pompey's army in Greece, and fought against Caesar's troops in the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. And we all know how that ended. Caesar won. Pompey was killed in Egypt. And Brutus? He was on the losing side. A traitor to Caesar. A man who'd fought against the man who'd saved him from ruin. Under any other Roman general, Brutus would have been executed. His property would have been seized. His family name would have been erased from history. But Caesar didn't do that. When he found Brutus hiding in the mountains after the battle, he didn't arrest him. He didn't kill him. He welcomed him back with open arms. He forgave him, publicly, and not just that, he gave Brutus a better job than he'd ever had under Pompey. First, he made him governor of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, one of the most important provinces in the empire. Then, a few years later, he made Brutus praetor urbanus, the top judicial official in the city of Rome, the second most powerful political position in the Republic after consul. Let's recap, because this is the part that makes the betrayal so unforgivable. By 44 BC, Julius Caesar had paid off Brutus's massive debts when he was young and broke, forgiven him for fighting on the enemy side in a civil war, given him multiple high-paying, prestigious political jobs that made him rich and powerful, and protected him from his enemies, elevating his status in Rome higher than his family had been in generations. Brutus owed Caesar his life. He owed him his career. He owed him his fortune. Every single thing Brutus had, he had because of Julius Caesar, and he still chose to kill him. That's the second big lie of the Ides of March. This wasn't a conflict between two political rivals with differing visions for Rome. This was a man betraying his greatest benefactor, the closest thing he had to a father figure, a man who'd never done anything but help him, and he did it not for the Republic, but because even after all Caesar had given him, Brutus was still broke, still drowning in debt, still terrified that Caesar was going to take it all away. Wait, how did Brutus end up in debt again, after getting that rich governorship? Because Roman politics was expensive, insanely expensive. To run for office, you had to throw games. You had to bribe voters. You had to pay for bodyguards, for political operatives, for public feasts to keep the people happy. The more power you wanted, the more money you had to spend. And Brutus wanted to be consul, the top job in Rome. So he spent money he didn't have, hand over fist. By 44 BC, Plutarch tells us Brutus owed over 13 million sesterces. To put that in perspective, a Roman soldier made about 900 sesterces a year. A middle-class merchant might make 10,000 sesterces a year. 13 million sesterces was enough money to pay the annual salary of over 14,000 Roman soldiers. In today's money, that's roughly $150 million. And Brutus wasn't the only one. Most of the senatorial elite was in debt. They lived lavish lifestyles. They spent fortunes on political campaigns. They borrowed money from each other, from wealthy bankers, from temple treasuries. And for decades they'd gotten away with it because they made the rules. They could set their own interest rate. They could seize land from common people who couldn't pay. They could pass laws that protected their own wealth, while everyone else struggled to get by. Then Caesar came along, and he started changing the rules. First, he capped interest rates at 12% a year. that destroyed the profits of wealthy senators who'd been making a killing loaning money at 40, 50, even 100% interest. Men like Brutus. Then, he ordered a debt audit. He said that all lenders had to declare how much they were owed, and that debtors could pay back what they could afford, based on the actual value of their property, not inflated prices. And then, the worst part for the elite. He canceled a huge portion of private debt for poor and middle-class Roman. He didn't cancel all debt. He never would have done that, because he was a politician who needed the support of the wealthy too. But he canceled enough that the senatorial class lost their mind. Because here's the thing they don't teach you in history class. The Roman Republic's freedom was only freedom for rich people. For the senatorial elite. Freedom to exploit the provinces. Freedom to charge whatever interest they wanted. Freedom to hoard land and wealth and power, while 99% of the population struggled to get by. When Caesar talked about reform, when he talked about helping the poor, he wasn't just being a populist. He was threatening the entire economic system that kept the senatorial class on top. This is where Brutus's family name becomes so important. Remember that ancestor I mentioned earlier? Lucius Junius Brutus? The guy who overthrew the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, in 509 BC, and founded the Roman Republic? That story was the cornerstone of Brutus's personal brand. Every Roman knew it. Every Roman associated the name Brutus with liberty, with overthrowing tyrants, with saving the Republic. But here's the dirty secret. Most of that story is made up. Modern historians now believe that Lucius Junius Brutus was at least partially a legendary figure. A myth invented by the Junius Brutus family hundreds of years later to justify their own power. The story of overthrowing the kings? It's a great story, but there's almost no contemporary evidence for it. Most of what we know comes from Livy, writing 400 years after the fact, who was basically repeating family legends. But it didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was that people believed it. And the conspirators knew that if they had Brutus on their side, they could wrap their entire coup in the flag of that ancient legend. They could say, look, the descendant of the man who founded the Republic is with us. This must be a just cause. That's why Cassius Longinus, the real leader of the conspiracy, worked so hard to recruit Brutus. He didn't need Brutus for his military skills. Brutus was a terrible general. He didn't need him for his political cunning. Brutus was indecisive, easily manipulated. He needed Brutus for his logo, for his brand, for the name Brutus, which meant liberty to every Roman. So who was Cassius, really? Gaius Cassius Longinus was a Roman senator, a general, and a man with a very personal grudge against Julius Caesar. This wasn't about the Republic for him either. This was about pride. About being passed over, about being humiliated by Caesar again and again. Cassius had fought under Caesar in the Gallic Wars early in his career, and he hated every second of it. He thought Caesar was reckless. He thought he took too much credit for other people's victories, and he resented that Caesar was always in charge, always the star, always the one getting all the glory. Later, during the Civil War, Cassius also sided with Pompey, and like Brutus, he was pardoned by Caesar after Pharsalus. But unlike Brutus, Cassius never got the promotions he thought he deserved. Caesar gave Brutus the praetor urbanus job, the top judicial position. He gave Cassius a lesser praetorship, one that dealt with foreign affairs. Cassius was furious. He thought he was more qualified, more experienced, more deserving than Brutus. But Caesar picked Brutus because he liked him more, because he was closer to his mother, because he saw Brutus as family. That humiliation ate at Cassius, and it wasn't the only one. Caesar had also publicly mocked Cassius in the Senate. He'd made jokes about him. He'd dismissed his ideas. And worst of all, Cassius was deeply in debt too. Just like Brutus, just like most of the senatorial class. And he knew that Caesar's planned Parthian campaign would only make Caesar more powerful, more popular, and more untouchable. If Caesar came back from Parthia victorious, there would be no stopping him. He'd be king in all but name. And men like Cassius and Brutus would be irrelevant. So Cassius started building a conspiracy. Not a movement for freedom. A coup. A plot to murder the most popular man in Rome before he could become too powerful to stop. And he knew the plot would never work without a figurehead. Without someone the people would respect. Someone with a famous name. Someone like Marcus Junius Brutus. Let's stop here for a second and call this what it is. The group that called themselves the Liberators? They weren't freedom fighters. They weren't patriots. They were a small clique of wealthy, privileged men who were so terrified of losing their power and privilege, they were willing to murder a popular, democratically supported leader to keep it. They didn't care about the Republic. If they cared about the Republic, they wouldn't have spent decades robbing the provinces blind. They wouldn't have bribed voters, fixed trials, and seized land from poor farmers. They wouldn't have spent their entire careers exploiting the system for their own benefit. The Republic was just a buzzword for them, a marketing slogan, a way to make their greedy, violent power grab look noble. And Brutus? He was the perfect face for that grab. He was respected. He came from a good family. He had that mythic ancestor. And he was desperate. Desperate enough to kill the man who'd saved his life, to get out of debt. So how did Cassius get Brutus to agree? He didn't just give him a speech about liberty. He hit him where it hurt. He reminded him of his debts. He told him that if Caesar stayed in power, he'd never be able to pay them back. That Caesar's debt reforms would ruin him. That Caesar would eventually turn on him, just like he'd turned on so many other senators. And then he played the family card. He asked Brutus what his famous ancestor would do. The man who'd overthrown the king. Would he sit by and let Caesar make himself king of Rome? Would he let the family name be tarnished by serving a tyrant? It worked. Brutus agreed to join. But he was never fully committed. He was racked with guilt. He couldn't sleep. He argued with his wife, Portia, who was Cato the Younger's daughter, another famous opponent of Caesar. He went back and forth, day after day, wondering if he was doing the right thing. And here's a detail almost no one talks about. Just 3 days before the Ides of March, Brutus almost called the whole thing off. He got into a huge fight with Cassius. He said killing Caesar was too risky, that the people would turn on them, that they'd all be executed. Cassius had to talk him down. He had to remind him again about his debt, about his family honor, about what would happen if Caesar came back from Parthia. Brutus caved. He agreed to go through with it. But he was never the leader. He never made any of the plans. He never decided when or where the assassination would happen. He just showed up. He was the mascot, the brand, the face of the operation. And Cassius let him think he was in charge, because that's what figureheads need. March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March. The day Caesar was supposed to leave for the Parthian campaign in just a few days. The Senate was meeting at the Theater of Pompey, a temporary meeting place while the new Senate House was being built. The conspirators had picked this day carefully. They knew Caesar would be there. They knew he wouldn't have his bodyguards with him. Senators weren't allowed to bring armed guards into the Senate chamber. But first, there's that famous story about the soothsayer, the old man who warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. You've seen that in every movie. It's one of the most famous moments in history. But do you know who that soothsayer was? His name was Spurina. And he wasn't just some random prophet. He was a political operative, working for the conspirators. Wait, let's be clear. We don't have definitive proof of this, but multiple ancient historians, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, hint at it. Spurina was a well-known Etruscan seer who had ties to the senatorial elite. He'd been giving Caesar warnings for weeks, and those warnings were intentionally vague. They were designed to make Caesar paranoid, to make him think something bad was going to happen, but not know what. Why would the conspirators do that? Because they wanted Caesar to be nervous, to be off his game. to be distracted by the prophecy, so he wouldn't see the attack coming. Also, after the assassination, the story of the soothsayer made the whole thing feel more inevitable, more fated, like Caesar was destined to die, which made the conspirators look like they were just carrying out the will of the gods. It was great PR. And it worked. For 2,000 years, people have told that story as proof of Caesar's arrogance, of how he ignored the warnings and brought his death on himself. But it was probably all a setup, a psychological operation planned by the conspirators to make their crime look like destiny. So Caesar almost didn't go to the Senate that day. His wife Calpurnia had a nightmare. She dreamed he was stabbed to death. She begged him to stay home. He almost did. But then one of the conspirators, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, no relation to Marcus Brutus despite the name, showed up at his house. He laughed off the dream. He told Caesar the Senate was going to offer him the crown of king, that he couldn't miss it. He flattered him. He manipulated him. And eventually Caesar agreed to go. He walked to the theater of Pompey, surrounded by senators. The crowd lined the streets. People cheered. No one had any idea what was about to happen. When he walked into the Senate chamber, the senators stood up to greet him. He sat down on his golden chair. Then, one of the conspirators, Tullius Cimber, stepped forward. He presented a petition, asking Caesar to recall his exiled brother. Caesar said he'd think about it. Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his neck. That was the signal. All at once, the conspirators struck. Daggers flashed. The first blow hit Caesar in the neck. He jumped up and fought back. He grabbed a stylus, his writing pen, and stabbed one of the attackers in the arm. He yelled. The room descended into chaos. Most of the other senators had no idea what was happening. They ran for the doors. They hid under their chairs. They didn't know who was attacking or why. Caesar kept fighting. He was 55 years old, but he was still a soldier. He'd fought in dozens of battles. He wasn't going to go down easy. But then, he saw him. Through the crowd of attackers, through the blood and the shouting, he saw Marcus Junius Brutus, standing there, dagger in his hand. And according to Plutarch, Caesar stopped fighting. He said one phrase in Greek, kai su teknon, which translates to you too, child. That's the only historical basis for the famous et2 brute line. And most historians don't even think it's true. Suetonius, who had access to imperial records and eyewitness accounts, says Caesar said nothing at all, that he just pulled his toga over his head and fell silent. The et2 brute line was invented by Shakespeare 1,600 years later, for dramatic effect. But whether he said it or not, the betrayal was real. The man he'd loved like a son, the man he'd saved again and again, was there to kill him. He stopped fighting. He let them stab him. 23 times. Most of the wounds were superficial. The final, fatal blow was to the chest. He fell forward, dead, at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old enemy, the man he'd defeated in the Civil War. So there you have it, the most famous assassination in history. And the man everyone remembers as the leader? Brutus? He didn't plan it. He didn't organize it. He barely even wanted to be there. He was just the face, the brand, the marketing tool. Cassius was the real mastermind. Cassius built the conspiracy. Cassius made the plans. Cassius picked the time and the place. Brutus was just there to make it look noble. That's the next big lie. Brutus wasn't the leader of the liberators. He was their mascot. A tragic, conflicted, debt-ridden mascot. And after the assassination, he was the one who got all the credit and all the blame. What happened next? Well, the conspirators thought the Roman people would cheer. They thought they'd walk out into the forum, announce that Caesar was dead, that the Republic was restored, and the crowd would throw flowers at them. They thought they'd be heroes. They were wrong. The Roman people loved Caesar. He'd given them land. He'd given them jobs. He'd given them games and feasts and hope for a better life. He was one of the few politicians who'd ever actually cared about them. When they heard he'd been murdered by a group of rich senators, they were furious. Brutus gave a speech in the forum, trying to explain why they'd killed Caesar. He talked about tyranny. He talked about liberty. He talked about the Republic. The crowd listened in silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just stood there, angry and confused. And then, when Mark Antony gave his famous funeral speech a few days later, the one Shakespeare made so famous, everything boiled over. Antony showed the crowd Caesar's blood-stained toga. He read Caesar's will, which left every Roman citizen 75 drachmas, 3 months' wages for a poor worker. And he left his gardens, his private park on the Tiber, open to the public forever. When the crowd heard that, when they saw the blood, they lost their minds. They rioted. They burned down the Senate house. They attacked the homes of the conspirators. They chased Brutus and Cassius out of the city, forcing them to flee to Greece in the middle of the night, with barely any money or soldiers. The people didn't see them as liberators. They saw them as murderers, as rich, entitled criminals who'd killed the people's champion. Brutus and Cassius spent the next 2 years building an army in Greece. They raised money by robbing more provinces. Surprise, surprise. They recruited soldiers. They made alliances with local kings. They thought they could come back to Rome, defeat Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian, and take back power. It didn't work. In 42 BC, the two armies met at the Battle of Philippi in northern Greece. Brutus and Cassius had twice as many soldiers as Antony and Octavian. They should have won, but they didn't. Cassius was defeated in the first phase of the battle, and he killed himself, thinking all was lost. Then Brutus fought on for a few more days, but his army was crushed. He was forced to retreat into the mountains, with just a handful of men. And then Brutus killed himself too. He fell on his own sword. For centuries, people have framed this as a noble act, a final stand for his principles, a way to die free rather than be captured. But that's not the real reason. Brutus knew exactly what would happen if he was captured. He'd be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, as part of Octavian's triumph. He'd be dragged through the dirt, mocked by the crowd that hated him. Then he'd be thrown into the Mamertine prison, the darkest, most terrible prison in Rome, and eventually executed, probably strangled to death in a dark cell. Brutus was a proud man. He came from one of the most prestigious families in Rome. He couldn't bear the thought of being paraded like a common criminal, of being humiliated in front of the entire city. So he killed himself, not for the Republic, not for principle, to avoid embarrassment, to avoid the consequences of his own actions. And here's the final, cruelest irony of this entire story, the one that makes the whole noble liberator myth collapse entirely. Brutus and the conspirators claimed they killed Caesar to save the Roman Republic. But in reality, their assassination is exactly what destroyed it forever. Let that sink in. Before the Ides of March, the Republic was still standing. Wounded, yes. Strained by civil war, yes. But the Senate still met. Elections still happened. The old institutions still functioned, even as Caesar bent them to his will. He held the title of dictator for life, but there was no formal dynasty, no permanent imperial system. There was still a path back to traditional republican governance, if the senatorial elite had been willing to compromise, to wait Caesar out. He was 55 years old, already in declining health, and would likely have been dead within a decade anyway. But they didn't wait. They chose murder. They chose violence. And in doing so, they burned the entire system to the ground. After the assassination, Rome descended into chaos, rioting in the street, political purges, a second civil war that dragged on for years, killing hundreds of thousands and draining the empire dry. When the fighting finally ended at Philippi, there was nothing left of the old republic to save. Octavian, Caesar's 19-year-old adopted heir, seized total power. He rebranded himself as Augustus, and turned Rome into a full-blown empire, with a single emperor at the top. The Senate became little more than a rubber stamp. The freedoms the conspirators claimed to defend? Gone forever. All because a handful of rich, entitled senators couldn't stand the idea of losing their privilege. All because Brutus was too proud to admit he was broke, and too cowardly to stand up to Cassius and his own class. That's the greatest lie of all. The saviors of the Republic didn't save anything. They killed it. They turned a flawed but surviving republic into a permanent dictatorship, all while patting themselves on the back for their moral courage. Now, let's be fair here. This doesn't make Caesar a hero. He wasn't. He was a ruthless, ambitious warlord who started a civil war to seize power. He killed over 1 million people in Gaul, enslaved hundreds of thousands more, all to expand the empire and boost his own reputation. He was a product of his brutal time, a man who would do anything to win. He wasn't a saint, and he wasn't a progressive champion of the people in any modern sense. He was a populist strongman who used the anger of the masses to gain power for himself. But here's the critical difference. Caesar's policies actually improved life for ordinary Romans. His land reform gave farms to military veterans who'd risked everything for the state. His debt relief saved thousands of middle-class families from being sold into slavery. His expansion of Roman citizenship gave people across the provinces a real stake in the empire. His public works projects, temples, roads, aqueducts, libraries, put thousands of unemployed Romans to work. He even reformed the calendar. The Julian calendar we still use today, with minor tweaks, is his legacy. For all his flaws, Caesar delivered tangible results for the 99%. The senatorial elite? They only delivered results for themselves. They hoarded half the land in Italy. They squeezed the provinces dry with illegal taxes and predatory loans. They bribed voters, fixed trials, and rigged the entire political system to make sure they stayed on top, and everyone else stayed below them. This is the real conflict at the heart of the Ides of March. It's not tyranny versus freedom. It's not republic versus empire. It's the many versus the few. It's a tiny, wealthy aristocracy fighting tooth and nail to hold onto their unearned power against a leader who built his base by giving even a little bit of power to the people they'd spent centuries exploiting. And Brutus? He chose the few. Every single time. He chose his class over the man who'd saved his life. He chose his bank account over the good of the Roman people. He chose his family's mythic reputation over the very republic he claimed to love. For 2,000 years, we've bought into the myth. We've read Plutarch's glowing biography, written based on letters from Brutus's own friend. We've memorized Shakespeare's dramatic lines, crafted to make Brutus a tragic hero. We've seen 100 movies and documentaries that frame the assassination as a noble stand for liberty. But it's all propaganda. A 2-millennia-old PR campaign, designed by a group of wealthy murderers to make their crime look like patriotism. And it worked. It worked so well, we're still repeating it today. The truth is far more brutal and far more familiar. The most famous betrayal in Western history wasn't driven by ideals. It was driven by debt, by greed, by fear, by a group of privileged men who were terrified of losing what they had. So they killed the man who threatened them, and they wrapped it all in the flag of liberty, so no one would look too close at the greed underneath. If this sounds eerily familiar to modern politics, if you've seen wealthy elites use patriotic language to justify policies that only benefit themselves while demonizing any leader who challenges their power, you're not imagining things. That's the thing about history. It doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The same dynamics play out over and over, century after century. The names change, the countries change, the systems change, but the core story stays the same. A small handful of rich and powerful people will do absolutely anything to hold onto their power. And they will always call it patriotism. So the next time someone tells you about Brutus the noble liberator, about the Ides of March as a great victory for freedom, remember the truth. Remember the 13 million sesterces of debt. Remember the predatory loans in Crete, the families sold into slavery to line Brutus's pocket. Remember the man who paid Brutus's debts, forgave his treason, lifted him to the heights of Roman power, and got 23 stab wounds in the back for it. Remember that the most noble-sounding stories in history are almost always covering up something much uglier, much greedier, much more human. Alright, let's wrap this up. If you made it this far, you now know the real, brutal truth behind the most famous betrayal in history. You know Brutus wasn't a tragic patriot. You know the liberators didn't save the Republic. You know the whole legend was built on debt, class warfare, and a 2,000-year-old marketing campaign. If this video changed how you see the Ides of March and Roman history, hit the like button right now. It helps the algorithm push this video to more people who are tired of the same old, watered-down, myth-filled history lessons. If you want more deep dives like this, more untold stories, more myth-busting, more brutal truth behind the history you thought you knew, hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. We drop a new full-length deep dive every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment down below and let me know, what's the biggest historical myth you used to fully believe until you found out the real story? Do you think Brutus was a straight-up villain, or just a weak, desperate man caught in an impossible situation? Let's hash it out in the comments. And before you go, here's one last hook to leave you thinking. We touched on Caesar's will today, how he left every Roman citizen cash, and opened his private gardens to the public forever. But there's one hidden detail in that will that almost no one talks about. A single line that completely destroyed Mark Antony's shot at seizing power and turned a 19-year-old kid named Octavian into the most powerful man in the world. Next week, we're breaking down the full, insane story of Julius Caesar's last will and testament and how one document created the Roman Empire. It's wilder than you can imagine, and you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.